Disclaimer: this episode may include graphic descriptions of crime and criminal activity. It therefore may not be suitable for listeners who are under the age of 18 or people who may find the descriptions as disturbing. Listeners' discretion is advised from this point forward. Hello and welcome to this episode of Crime KE podcast. My good name is Ajuma. I am a journalist from Kenya and your host for this true crime podcast. Now, before we start, I forgot to say this last week, but this podcast is now available to stream on YouTube. My YouTube channel is Ajuma on YouTube. Just go to the podcast tab and you'll find the podcast. Yeah. Now, today's episode is story number 8, and it's also the last story of season 2. And today we are going to unpack the story of a very well-known crime writer in Kenya. We are going to unpack the story of JohnKiriamiti. Now, you have probably heard of JohnKiriamiti because he has authored several books documenting his life in crime. I have personally just read one of the books, which is My Life in Crime. And it was a crazy story. I read the book like 10 years ago, and I remember at some point wondering whether it was actually a work of fiction or not. Now, if you love reading, then you should look for Kiriamiti's books. There is My Life in Crime, Son of Fate, there is My Life with a Criminal, Sinister Trophy, just to name the ones at the top of my head. I think there is also My Life in Prison, where he documents his life in prison basically, or the events of what happened when he was in prison. Without further ado, let us get into today's episode. Also, please stick around until the end of this episode to find out how you can support this podcast. JohnKiriamiti was born on February 14th of 1950 in Tuita, Murang'a County. He was the second born of 9 children, and he said their parents provided them with a stable life. His parents were both teachers, so they were very strict, but other than that, they lived like a normal Kenyan family growing up in the 50s. Kiriamiti said that he was a sharp kid in school, so he performed really well in primary school. At least he performed well enough to be called to high school at Nairobi School. Now, at the time, Nairobi School was called Prince of Wales Secondary School, and the majority of students in the school were actually white. He joined the school in Form 1 in 1967, and he found that there was a lot of segregation in the school. Actually, I don't know if segregation is really the right word. I think the way he described it, I would say it was racism. So he found that in this majority white school, the black students like him were discriminated against. He said that this did not sit well with him, so he would often be caught fighting with these white boys all the time. Like if he felt that he was being discriminated against, he would just fight them. And this would result in him getting expelled from school in Form 1. At this time, he was only 15 years old. Now, when he was expelled, he made the decision to drop out of school altogether. He said that he decided to drop out because he was scared of his strict parents. Like when he was given the expulsion letter, he knew that he couldn't take it back to his parents because his parents would literally finish him. That was how strict they were. So instead of going back home to Murang'a, he decided to hit the streets of Nairobi, and that was the beginning of his life in crime. He said that he would stay on some of the most famous streets in the city, from River Road to Kenyatta Avenue, just moving around and looking for a way to survive. He said that he lived and slept in the streets of Nairobi, and he had to fend for himself for a while until he actually made a friend in the streets. Now, how did this happen? He said it was daytime and he was sitting at the OTC area of Nairobi town, and he noticed this guy pickpocketing someone, and he watched the whole thing, and after that he approached the guy and he asked him to teach him how to do that so that he can also survive. And this guy actually agreed. And this became the first friend that Kiriamiti made in the streets. This guy helped him find a house in Makadara where he lived with 2 other guys, which was a safer option than sleeping in the streets of Nairobi. They were all of them, all the 3 of them sleeping in that house were involved in pickpocketing. He survived on that until he was able to take on bigger risks as a criminal. He said that he knew at that time when he was living in Makadara, he knew that there were bank robbers of Nairobi meeting around the OTC area of Nairobi town. So he went there, he went where they usually met and introduced himself. And they actually welcomed him to the group. And he was invited to a robbery. The first ever robbery he was involved in was in Westlands. What they would do was that most of the time, the group would work with an insider who would basically tell them maybe someone was going to withdraw money at a particular day and at a particular time at a particular bank, and the gang would wait for that person outside the bank and rob them. He said that at first he was not allowed to carry a gun by the gang. His work was doing the pickpocketing as someone else with a gun guarded him to help him get away. He was given this role in the group because he had a small body, so they knew that he was able to move fast. So yeah, in his first robbery, the gang waited outside a bank in Westland for their victim to withdraw money. And when he got out, they snatched 30,000 Kenyan shillings from him and they got away using a getaway car. Now, after a few of such robberies, just waiting for their victims outside the banks, Kiriamiti said that he flaunted the idea to the gang that instead of waiting outside the bank for people to withdraw money, they should go inside and get it from the bank themselves. This was in the late 60s, and at this time, most banks didn't have as much security as they do today. In fact, Kiriamiti said that most of the bank counters that they invaded did not have those grills. I'm not sure if that is the right one for it, but those grills that they have now at the tellers. The gang will always had someone working on the inside. Like if it was a bank, a teller would, or even a security guard would approach the gang and give them information, like something that they would need to have a successful robbery. They would tell them things like which counter had the most money so that they would start there when they go to rob. Or maybe if there was a panic button that could be pressed, they would tell them where it was and how to prevent someone from alerting the police before the robbery ended. Things like that. This gang planned their robberies to the details, like there was no room for errors. Kiriamiti said that they planned the robberies in such a way that they would be in and out of a bank in less than 10 minutes. His first bank robbery happened when they robbed the Bank of Baroda in Nairobi town, and the gang made away with a lot of money. An insider actually approached them in this robbery, and they told them that this bank would be a good target to rob, and they planned it, and they were successful. Now, remember, they're very successful with their planning, that even the insider that approaches them does not get the information about the robbery so that the gang does not risk getting caught. They would end up robbing this specific Bank of Baroda 4 other times, and Kiriamiti says that it was the location of the bank that made it favorable to get away with that many robberies. It was located in an open area which was secluded at the same time. Now, his name and face came on the police radar sometime in the early 70s when his gang had planned to rob a bank in Naivasha. And on the same day, the president at the time was scheduled to be in Nakuru. So, there was a lot of security because the president had to go through Naivasha to get to Nakuru. But the thing is, this gang was actually successful in this robbery, and they actually made away with 500,000 Kenyan shillings. This robbery took 6 minutes, and they were able to get away with that amount of money in 6 minutes. So you can see that there was a lot of planning that went into these robberies to make sure that they do not flop or they aren't caught, because they had to think about not only the security at the bank, but also the president is around. So anything can happen. And there were only five gang members, and they made away with 500,000 Kenyan shillings. That was, I don't want to say good planning, but it was good planning because 500K was a lot of money in the 1970s. And to be able to do that in 6 minutes, I mean, come on. So this was the robbery that brought his face to the limelight. And this was the time that a wanted poster was created with his face and name on it. And Kiriamiti said that once that happened, he had to be careful because he was an easily identifiable person. So once he was on a poster written wanted dead or alive, he knew that police would find him quicker than they expected. Now, this was also the time when Patrick Shaw, I don't know if you remember Patrick Shaw, the Mzungu cop from the Wakinyonga episode. This was also the time when Shaw was assigned to Kiriamiti and his gang. And Patrick Shaw was actually unsuccessful for the most part in capturing Kiriamiti's gang because they managed to evade police for a very long time. They evaded the police until Shaw was tipped off on the gang's plans to hang out at a club on River Road one afternoon. Now, the gang had planned a rendezvous at this club. Now, when Kiriamiti arrived at the club to meet with his friend, he found Shaw and other police officers waiting for him. Of course, not that he could have obviously identified them, but he said that he had the feeling that they were being watched by the police when they were at the club. He actually acted out of this feeling and hid his gun in his girlfriend's purse because he felt that something was not right and they would be caught. That afternoon, police caught them and he ended up in jail for 7 years. Kiriamiti described prison as the worst place to be, but he said that when he went to prison, he met and networked with other criminals. He said that he learned even more tricks from them, and when he got out of prison, he immediately went back to a life of crime. Now, it was during this time that he was shot in the back during a robbery. He managed to get away, but the police knew that he would need medical attention. So, police alerted all the hospitals around Nairobi. There were police in the hospitals because they knew he would show up with a gunshot wound eventually. Kiriamiti knew that he could not go to the hospital, so he decided to go and recuperate back at home in Murang'a. But the thing is, police had also alerted the area chief in Murang'a, so when Kiriamiti showed up in the area, the chief called police and basically told them to come and get the guy. So police acted immediately. They went to Murang'a to Kiriamiti's mother's house and arrested him. At this time, Kiriamiti was only 22 years old. And he was taken to court and sentenced to serve 28 years in prison for robbery with violence. Now, he said that when he was given that sentence, he knew that his life was over because he knew that he would be way older when he got out. He got depressed while in prison. But he said that it was actually the older inmates who reassured him and tried to tell him that prison does not mean that his life was over. So he decided to lock in, like literally. He said that he decided to stop wasting time and started to figure out what he could do with his life. He decided that he would educate himself. Remember, he was already a sharp student in the first place, so that wasn't a hard thing. So he befriended like prison guards and convinced them to bring him learning materials like books, pens, and things like that. He managed to study a journalism course while in prison and to even write a novel at the same time. That was actually when he wrote the book My Life in Crime. A prison warden helped him to get the manuscript of the novel to his sister, who was outside, and his sister actually sent the manuscript to an editor. He says that it was actually Ngugi wa Thiong'o, the famous writer, who convinced this editor to publish his book. That was in 1984. The book came out in 1984. It was published by the East African Educational Publishers. The book came out and it was an instant bestseller immediately after publishing. And the thing is, Kiriamiti had no idea that this book he had written while in prison was this big of a deal outside. This book documents his life in crime in very great detail. It provides like a criminal's side of the story I can't remember much of the details of the book because I read it a long time ago, but I remember how interesting it was. Like, I remember how I felt reading the book. I remember rooting for this criminal like every step of the way because that is how good of a writer he was. If you haven't read this book, then you should pick it up and thank me later. It had more details than I could ever like put in one podcast episode. Like, apart from the bank robberies, he writes about escaping police. He writes about one instance when he escaped arrest at the airport, when he literally escaped through the toilet window because he knew that the police were waiting for him outside the toilet. He also writes about a point where he faked insanity so that he could be admitted at a mental institution so that he could escape. And the most intriguing part of the story for me was the part where he writes about how he flees Kenya and ends up in Congo. He lives there as a fugitive for a while, and he lives a pretty good life because he finds a very good job working for a tycoon, and he's treated well by his boss, and his boss actually trusts him with everything. But he eventually leaves Congo for reasons that I will not say on this podcast. But I think you should read the book. He also writes about his longtime girlfriend, Millie. And the book gives an interesting perspective of a criminal's life, basically. At some point, it is actually hard to believe that this book is not just a work of fiction, but Kiriamiti has always maintained that the books are based on his actual life and crime. So yeah. And there are also very few records available to corroborate his stories. At the time when My Life in Crime came out, remember, Kiriamiti still had no idea how much of a hit the book was, but the prison authorities did because, yeah, he started teaching other inmates and even the wardens English. It wasn't until he was put in solitary confinement that he found out about the impact of the book. Now, he did not stay in prison for the 28 years he was sentenced to. He was released after 13 years in jail. And immediately he was out, he got a lot of media attention. As you can imagine, this is a famous writer now who is not only a criminal, but he's now a famous writer who has been in prison and has documented his life. So a lot of media houses want to know whether his story is true and all that. He went ahead and wrote for some of the leading media houses like The Standard and even Nation. He did get arrested again in 1987, but this time it was because he was suspected of being part of a group called Mokenya. This was a group that was suspected of wanting to overturn President Moi's government. After this arrest, he stayed in prison for 3 years and he was released in February of 1990. And after that, he quits crime, he became a philanthropist and a social reformer helping street kids and thieves in Murang'a. He wanted to help them get away from crime, and he says that is the actual reason why he wrote the book, to show the youth that crime does not pay. He teaches behavioral change to students, and yeah, he helps criminals reform. That is his way of giving back to the community now. He says that he does not regret his past because it is his past that made him get to where he is. And one last thing, Kiriamiti has consistently maintained that throughout his crime life, he has never shot anyone because he believes that guns are supposed to be used to scare and not to kill. I don't know. Well, thank you for listening to this episode until the end. That is all I have for you on this episode on the story of JohnKiriamiti. Again, if you haven't read his books, then you probably should. I think I will also look for the rest of the books that I haven't read and get into them. Yeah. This is the last episode of season 2. Next week, I will be doing a bonus episode. Yeah, so follow the podcast on social media if you don't already. As I said in the beginning of the episode, Crime KE podcast is now available on YouTube. My YouTube channel is Ajuma on YouTube. You will find this podcast on the podcasts tab. You can find the podcast on Instagram at crime.ke. I usually post the crime cases that I talk about on the podcast and also updates on cases from season 1 and even just educational content that I find insightful. Yeah, if you have any feedback on the podcast, you can share through my social media platforms or the podcast Instagram page or even the comment section on Spotify and YouTube. My social media handles are on the show notes of the episode. Yeah, reach out. I love interacting with you guys. Other than that, rate the podcast on the platform that you're listening in on, and don't forget to catch the next episode of Crime KE Podcast on Thursday next week as we wrap up season 2. Same time and same place, but until then, stay safe and remember, it's crime with a K.